Panel, the biggest question for us in opening government is who really watches the watchman, ladies and gentlemen. What we want to prove to you is why we will have fewer victims of police. Why, and specifically the biggest impact here obviously is on minorities that get uniquely victimized by them. Now what I'm going to do is specifically show why is this, first of all, why is this the biggest impact that we have. Note that the police are uniquely unaccountable while at the same time having unique powers over people on the ground. This results in overreach in terms of brutality, this results in death. I think we all can agree that that is bad. Moving on. Like what is this going to look like? Look, we understand that this may to some extent detract from the effectiveness of your police work in terms of making you potentially overly cautious. We don't believe that that actually is a massive trade-off that we have to take, particularly because right now we're counteracting a massive prevalence in terms of overreach that is incentivized within the system. But how are we going to do this? We are going to roughly envision this the way that we also do this already in status quo with the military, right? We understand that the commander to a large extent is responsible for the actions of their own soldiers on the ground. And it's specifically the idea that there is no good accountability mechanism towards the populations that they police, that they shoot down, that they have force over. That basically means that you need to basically have the person who is in control, who does have responsibility, who gives them these orders to basically face judgment. Now, first thing, why are you... Okay, sure, clarification.
What level of police and what kind of punishment, like how many years in prison or whatever are we talking about?
Well, that depends on the case very much, right? Like specifically and what level of police, we think of course like the biggest impact that we have here is in terms of you run a police department, you decide where they're deployed, you are responsible for the kind of culture you instill within your men, you tell them how to view the people out there. There's a difference between saying these are animals that you need to control and these are people that you need to help serve and protect when they call you. Like very much specifically how you hype up your men, how you talk to them, very much explicitly dictates the culture that you have within that police department. That makes you responsible. In addition to that, it is very important to understand that when you're a police chief, you have a lot of control over what your soldiers do and think, right? You are the one who chooses whom you send on the beat, who you put behind a desk, and whom you decide to police the more affluent community that is a bit more white. You are the one who is uniquely in the position, because of the way that you closely interact with your workers and all the background information that you have on them, in terms of engaging, who has racist biases, who has a particularly belligerent kind of outlook on life, who is one that you are most likely to trust with whom, right? And specifically, this is something that you have control over. Note that specifically when you have that mechanism, you don't really have the bad apple defense anymore. You can't claim this is a rogue officer. You basically have a direct chain of responsibility to the top, right? Specifically, the kind of cases that we can stop this way is the kind of travesties that you have, for example, in the United States, where an officer got shuffled around department by department because it was known to be mentally unstable, because it was known to have weird views, and guess what? He ended up shooting Tamir Rice, an 11-year-old, because he panicked and at the point at which he saw a BB gun. These things are avoidable. There are red flags all around the world. We believe that you police officers, like police commanders, are uniquely good at this, right? Now, no thank you. Now, what am I going to do now? I'm going to show you specifically how our world will change, right? Note that in the status quo, we have massive problems structurally within police departments. Why is that true? It is true because within police departments, and you work in that environment, you very much put strong emphasis on loyalty. You are a united front versus the thing that you're policing, right? This is a toxic sort of narrative that breeds themselves into police departments all over the world, right? Specifically, this kind of closing ranks is something that means that you protect your like-minded. Specifically, in trials and court cases, etc., but also in terms of internal affairs investigations, right? Specifically when they try to infiltrate the police departments, internal affairs is really shit at doing this, because as soon as anyone has any form of suspicion that you're internal affairs, people close ranks, they shut you out. This is a mechanism that failed. In addition to that, what other mechanism could there be, for example, in the status quo? Like when it's specifically the prosecutors, the district attorneys that consistently work together with police and with individual police officers on a consistent basis and need to keep that goodwill, or in status quo, we have the massive problem that here already we don't see police officers facing justice often, right? This is a problem. What the kind of travesties that results in is Rodney King being beaten half to death on the streets of LA, with all officers getting out of it because they were under duress, under bad situations, etc. Now, what is the difference in our world? Sure, opening.
how do you envision the police officer reacting with their commanders? How do you like pretend him to tell the people not to be brutal? How is he going to do that?
Oh, thank you. How about this? Every time you do a briefing call, you talk to your commanders in terms of what they're going to do, what the mission statement is, their prep talk. You frame it very differently. You don't frame it with everyone is dangerous for you, and you have to be able to basically do your job, and that goes beyond everything. You tell them to be cautious. You tell them to take a step back. You tell them to reevaluate. But in addition to that, those that you don't trust to basically be able to handle this, you don't send them where they are most likely to endanger people. That is the thing. Now, what is our world going to look like specifically here? Look, we think commander incentives fundamentally change, right? Already at the point at which you are criminally liable for these things, that sphere alone, regardless of how de facto likely it is that the first case is going to get you in jail, is going to be a massive incentive to be as careful as you can with your police officers, to basically make sure that you make that as less likely as possible. Look, we acknowledge that sometimes you're not going to go into jail because of closed rank mechanisms. But guess what changes even in those cases? Even in those cases, at the point at which you have instilled a toxic culture, the point at which you've got systematic structural problems in your police department, you are likely to go to court time and time again. At the point at which you go to court the second time, the third time, the fourth time, that is the point at which the mayor will fire you. That is the point at which someone else will get you into this. So in addition to already the very strong sword of Damocles potentially hanging over your head, that can ruin your life tangibly at the point at which there's a clear-cut case of police brutality, a clear-cut case of genuine harm, that is already a big incentive. But even in the cases where you are able to sneak away a bit with it again and again, that is the point you'll notice, that is the point where your career ends. We are extremely proud to propose at the point at which we can prove to you that we will have less Tamir Rices, that we will have less Rodney Kings, that we will have better systematic interaction between the police and people on the ground, right? When we talk about community policing in lots of debates, this is a mechanism by which you can get that too, right? That is the delta in this debate. What we give up is to a certain extent efficacy, and I'm curious to see what opening opposition has to say. Here.
I thank the Prime Minister and I pick up on the Leader of Opposition.
Two points in opening opposition. First, we're going to show why these officers are not responsible of what's going on. They have no control of their demands as the extent as OG says. And secondly, and crucially, we're going to prove how this is going to damage the ability of the police to fight in the criminal areas, in the neighborhoods which are marginal and which are the ones we need more the protection of the police. First, a counterfactual. We say that in status quo, this problem is not so big as they're saying, and it's increasingly decreasing with time. First, because stigmas in minorities are reducing with time. Secondly, because education is being higher and higher between the police. And thirdly, because they are putting higher exams in order to enter the police because they don't want all these standards. Just to show how was the police in the United States or in Europe in the 70s and how it's now, we can see that this problem is decreasing. It's not perfect, but obviously it's like in the good path, and we think that maintaining status quo, this is going to be all right. First point, which will respond mostly to OG, is why they are not responsible. We think that the characterization of these people is not good enough. We think that these people is not so obvious racist and violent people which offend the citizens many times. We think that most times they are first-time offenders which really low to see that they are violent or they are not. Why say that? First, because in most countries dangerous and which one are not dangerous, and therefore they have to put them in the same task. And when something bad happens, it's not their fault because they have no way to show that this is bad. What's the impact of the argument? The impact of the argument is how you are destroying the life of this officer for no reason because they did nothing wrong. They will obviously they will get fired from the police. Secondly, they will be linked for the felony of the offender. If one of your men kill a guy, you are going to be considered a murderer. Thirdly, you are going to be put in jail, which means probably that you will have a really shitty life because police guys in jail are suffering a lot for all the criminals that they were, and because police obviously are not good treated in prison. And fourthly, and even more important, because they will not have a job again. Never. Most of these police guys are not people educated, and when they are going out of the police, a police with a stigma is never going to go out of this. If they do not prove that these guys have like a huge burden of this about this, the debate are taken by us. No, thank you. Second point and crucial in this debate: why police is going to fail in order to continue fighting the crime in neighborhoods which are marginal. We can see that probably they will be reducing the police abusement over the citizens, but the reason why is very different what they say. Can we characterize the police brutality in the status quo? It's not that when you interact with your men and you say, let's be violent, and they are violent. Usually what happens is that you put your police in high pressure, for example, a stressful situation with gangs in a neighborhood or with criminal bands all around. Secondly, they have really few times to react, and therefore they have to take quick decisions. And thirdly, in that situation of stress, their internal biases which have happened since they are kids, not for couple of things that the commander say. Obviously, with 20 years, they are not convincing you to be violent. You are violent by yourself, or you are racist by yourself because that's something that starts much younger. What happened is that in that situation in migrant neighborhoods where the drug dealers are, where the people, where the bands of criminals are, you have like a bad moment and commit that. What does this mean? That means that this changes crazily the incentives of the officers in order to deal with this problem. Now they can they can put all the officers, all the mans, all the police in that place in order to control them. But now, if you are an officer and you know you have to be 25, 30 years as an officer in the police, you know that if you continue pushing against the drug cartel in that neighborhood where there is a lot of minorities, where there is a lot of crime, and where there is a lot of problems, it's highly likely that in a stressful moment your officer is going to commit a mistake and is going to abuse their power and kill someone innocent or do something bad to some of them. What's the consequence of this? That clearly you are not going to have 30 years of certainty in that. You are going to say today, hey, I want to avoid jail. Don't do this. Don't go so often to these places. And if you go, you cannot shoot anyway. You cannot catch a criminal just because you think he's doing. You are not going to show your patrols over the place all the time, because that's dangerous for your personal security. That means that every time you put a man in a favela in Brazil, you are putting your security in problems, because in a favela it's really likely that a case of police abusement happens.
Sir?
Why is the consequence of this? No, thank you. We think that this makes that the crime will proliferate much easier in these places. They don't have to hide anymore inside houses. They can do it like in the favela openly. They don't have to renovate constantly the people which catch in the street in order to maintain their band in action. And thirdly, they can commit their crimes like at the light of day. They don't have to like being escaping putting away and hiding from the police, which is ronding their neighborhood. Closing.
In El Paso, Texas, police officers in their shooting range shoot at pictures of Hispanics who are called MS-13 members. Officers decide that kind of policy.
Thank you. If that's is that because that's illegal? That's already illegal. If the officer is personally responsible of what happened, because the officer knows that the abusement was happening, then he's already in the status quo responsible of what's happening. This policy is especially when they are not like directly responsible of the abuse. So I think that this is out of the debate. What's the impact of this argument? That means that you are going to destroy, that the crime is going to be higher in these towns, and that means a lot for this neighborhood. That means that these criminal people are going to be destroying public services. They're going to make impossible normal businesses in their own, because they will blackmail those businesses and make feel unsafe because there is no police over there, and therefore make those businesses not work. They will mean that childs will go into drugs and to band much easier, because the cool guys, the guys which are controlling the neighborhood, the ones that even the police is able to face, are controlling my neighborhood, that they are selling those, so the cool thing to do is to join them. We think that police presence in those neighborhoods is key in order to maintain this under control and constantly and step by step reducing this, and we are not obtaining this with this policy. Even if we have some problems with police abusement, nothing to compare with real criminals which day by day destroy neighborhoods and destroy the life of these people. We are very proud to propose.
I think the leader of opposition, I'm going to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Panel, Panel, 2 points for you today. First of all, which are going to directly clash with opening opposition's material. First of all, why the Chief of Police is responsible. I'm going to, Calix already did some on this. I'm just going to contextualize some of the engagement that happened on that. And second of all, why I do think the police is still going to be doing their jobs on a very principled level. But before that, just 1 point of very much extraneous rebuttal. Note that opening opposition's significant outside of their points rebuttal is that the stigma has reduced, it doesn't happen so much anymore, it's not so big a problem. If there is no unjustified police brutality, then police chiefs won't be going to jail. We don't think that then that policy has any negative impact, and then we don't understand why we can't do it if it has any of the positive outcomes we bring. We think that's incredibly uncomparative. We think that falls outside of this debate. Furthermore, we do think that lots of cases of unjustified police brutality still happen in status quo. Every year there are hundreds of shootings in the United States of unarmed black men who are dead for no accountable reason. We think it's ludicrous to claim that there is no such thing as unfair police brutality. At best they're saying there's no debate here. We don't think that's true. Onto the constructive then. So what do we hear from opening opposition? First of all, that the police chief is not responsible. They are telling us that first-time offenders, they might go to jail. Secondly, they tell us it'll just hide racism. Thirdly, they tell us we're destroying the life of someone who has done nothing wrong. Note that Calix gives a very clear characterization on this, why police chiefs are accountable. The first and most important of these criteria is that police chiefs are responsible for the culture that exists in a unit. What does this mean? That means that when inside a unit, people say, as a response to Black Lives Matter, no, all lives matter, or no, blue lives matter, that creates a culture in which they ignore the underlying problem of police brutality against minority groups in their communities. Second of all, we think that a kind of culture of how you interact with your guns, the kind of culture that you create of how you, when you pull your weapon, the kind of culture that you when you say the people you're policing are animals or whether they're people. We think all these kinds of things, the discourse that happens within the precinct also shapes the behavior of the officer when they're on the street, when they're on the beat, when they're doing their jobs. We're saying this specifically, that kind of culture is going to be impacted. Why is that controlled by the chief of police? Because we're saying the chief of police is present. The chief of police is in the station, not yet. The chief of police is in the station and he knows his officers, or she knows them. They know their officers, right? We're saying that specifically, in and of itself, the fact that they know exactly who these people are means that they are capable of making the kind of decisions of who goes where and also how they interact with them. That also means that in turn, that when their officer does something wrong, that the chief of police is accountable towards those actions. Why is that so? First of all, because we say that when you send someone into a mission, you're the one who gave the order. We think this is already in and of itself a crucial piece of analysis. We say this is something that we already do in the military. Now, why do we do this in the military? Because we say that you're accountable for the action of your officer. We say that that we want to incentivize you to make sure that your soldiers do as they should, and we want to ensure that you foster this kind of culture. Why do we think that police officers are analogous to soldiers? First of all, they are people who are given special exclusions to the kind of laws that govern all of us. For instance, they are allowed to carry guns where most people are not allowed to carry guns. This gives them the kind of power that's already outside and beyond that of a normal citizen, that also places responsibilities on them that don't exist for average citizens. We think that mechanism in and of itself means that they have responsibilities placed upon them that normal citizens don't. We think that then when there's a certain amount of additional power they get, and these these responsibilities also carry certain criteria. We're saying that when we give you that kind of power, we want you to be as careful with that as you possibly can. We want you to be as responsible as you can with that. And so we think that it is all right for a police officer to first think before they pull their gun, to first think before they shoot, to think not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times before they pull their gun. We think that police officers also consent to this idea of risking their lives the moment they become officers. We say you know when you accept to become a police officer that this is something that can happen to you. We say that then by extension you also accept that risk. We say that in and of itself makes the police officer already permissible to be held under special criteria. We say they're like soldiers, and we say soldiers are the extension of the will of their officers, or in this case the police officer to their commander. Closing.
Even if police are trying to change that culture, thanks to your policy, you still keep the status quo violent cops who will propagate that culture among each other because they probably still have it internalized.
Okay, first of all, we think it's more likely to change on our side of the house. So at worst, we have no change, but we think it's more likely to change on our side of the house, as we've already pointed out. Second of all, we say that chiefs of police have a massive incentive to change the culture that exists with them, based on the last point of Calix's analysis, which was the whole idea that even if police officers don't get tried, which I think they might be going to run, we think there's still the incentive that if in your specific precinct there end up being police brutality over and over and over again, and you keep getting called out, then the mayor is going to be pressured, is going to be lobbied against. People are going to say, we're not going to vote for you unless you change the chief of the police. I think Calix already preemptively engages with that. So the second point we get from opening opposition, which I think is interesting, is this idea that the police aren't going to be doing their jobs anymore. Note several things on that. First of all, we have no idea why the fact that they're accountable for their actions means they're not going to be doing their jobs. And you know what? The more importantly, we think that specifically, if that means police do their jobs properly, we prefer one where they do less of their jobs but do it properly than when they don't, than them doing it incorrectly. We prefer a world in which no innocent gets shot just like this. We prefer that some criminals get away. We prefer that as a principle on our side of the house, because we think that the police, and by extension the state, has more of a responsibility to maintain the life of innocents than they do to capture criminals. We think that on the comparative then, it is significantly more likely that on our side of the house we do less damage. We think that kind of principle also extends further, right? Furthermore, but additionally, opening opposition tell us that the incentives change to no longer fight the cartel. We don't think that's true. We think the police is going to make sure they're cartel, and then it's not police brutality. We think that when you shoot a member of the cartel, someone who's actually armed, someone who's actually a criminal, that's not police brutality. That is within the confines of the law. At that point, a police officer doesn't commit a crime. We think there are still all the incentives in the world for police officers to be doing their job. We don't think that this is a particularly likely world or a particularly comparative world that opening opposition paint us. We also don't think that. We also think that given that at their best, just nothing changes on either side of the house, and at best on our side, we have fewer dead innocents. We easily win this debate. So proud to propose.
I think we get the Prime Minister and stop on that to do your proposition.
I'm going to answer 2 simple questions in this speech. First, is this something fair to do? And secondly, is this something utilitarian good for the communities it is ought to protect? First, on if it's something fair to do. Basically, the logic of OG, it's a utilitarian justification that says that given that you reduce police brutality, you should put them to criminal prosecution. My rebuttal to this is that most of the things that they envision to happen can happen also without the requirement of criminal prosecution. When I asked him in a POI what would he envision the police officer commander to do, he said chats, more education, and less hiring of bad officials. I don't see why you need to require criminal prosecution in order for this to happen. You can make it compulsory in order to be an official. You can promote them more if they do it. You can make massive education programs, and you kick them out if you see that they have the culture that CG told they have. The burden of government here, it is not to prove that is an efficient technique, but rather that it is the only or unique way to convince those police in order to do the things they claim. What we told you in this point of fairness is that the degree of culpability of those police officers is so low compared to the crime or to the consequence you are attaching to them that it is wrong to do it in the first place. Why? Firstly, because they're first-time offenders, and even when they maximize diligence, it is difficult to control. The response that we get from OG is, look, but they're responsible of the culture, so they don't intervene in the culture. We have two rebuttals here. First, that the culture of some communities, for example in Alabama, is not given by that police officer commander who hires people which are already 30 years old. They are not responsible of the culture of their people. Maybe they're not stopping, but look, even when they put maximum diligence, and this is the second rebuttal, many times it's impossible to control that because it is not caused only by that, but rather by tension, by situations where you can't control, by stigmas that you have interiorized that have nothing to do with him preventing you from doing it. The consequence of this is that you are attaching to someone who in the most vast majority of cases is not responsible and could have put the vast amount of diligence in the situation and a stigma for his life. You're sending this cop to a prison for 5, 10, 6 years, and you're attaching to him a consequence that is so bad for his life. The amount of depression, the difficult when you go out from prison, and the consequences for his life, for example, to find a new job, to be able to encounter a new life, to gain, like the previous situations, for those police officers is so bad. What is the way in here? Their proposal was not to justify that this would solve anything, but rather if there's a unique way to solve anything, because if you have other ways to solve the situation, like Javi explained, like probably you won't solve it in 5 to 10 years, but what we're telling you is that every single criminal, like every single cop in America that had a responsibility ought not to be to prison just by the fact that they think that the policy is justified. Even if it's utilitarianly good, we think it is not justified due to the disproportionate of the consequences. That is the first point. Second point, why do we believe that it is more harmful to the communities that it is ought to protect in the first place? No, look, the point here is very important. Javi told you how the change that will happen is that they will be sending less people to situations which are really required. The only answer that we get from OG is that they prefer their job to be done properly. This is the entire definition of straw manning. What Javi told you is 4 things. Firstly, that they will feel extreme fear in order to send them to certain villages, to certain places. I can't imagine some police sending someone to a favela in Brazil just of the fear that they have. Look, when you adjudicate this point, on the analysis OG gave you on why will they fear the situation. Because of that analysis, it is true that they will be not sending people to situations that could be very needed. Secondly, you don't send them because you don't trust your ability to control them in every meaningful situation. And there's a good reason for this, because many times it's not just the stigma. Even if you told them, look, don't do it for 1 year, maybe a situation arises when he needs to do someone and you can't control it because human nature may be provoked that he reacted poorly to a situation and he felt fear. If he was fearful in that concrete situation, you cannot control that person's fear, probably even if you chatted with him for a year. If he's like under threat, I don't think that he's gonna be able to change that even so. What's the consequence of this? The consequence is that you get more areas in the world, the precise areas they're saying that needs to be protected, without protection. This implies police officers not going to a situation in Alabama when someone is threatened to death by other person who is a criminal. This implies police officers not going to, a favela in Brazil where the drug cartel is over there. What is the consequence of this, for these communities? What is the comparative? First, that in our world, you get progressive disappearance of police brutality. You don't make that happen in 5 years, maybe not in 10 years, but it will happen. The difference is that in our world, you know that it is important not to do police brutality, but still, you don't fear the consequence of sending those polices over there. You don't fear as much as is in OG world that happening, hence it is more likely that you do it. I'll go to the impact of this argument after the POI.
Look, besides the fact that police officers who don't do their job will eventually also get replaced for not doing their job, we think it's more important to break those bonds of loyalty between officers that keep bad officers in positions where they can murder innocent people.
Yeah, so the point is that this, you don't require to put criminal prosecution to the person. That part of my speech is already responded. I believe that you can just kick out that person, kick out that DA, kick out everyone you believe is within that loyalty. But even if not, our case proves why many situations cannot be controlled even if you don't have that loyalty they claim that exists.
Let's go to the impact for those communities of not having these police forces going to that situation as a consequence of the fear of the people that are in church. We think that it is not marginal because it's not only controlling the concrete situation of the drug selling. Panel, note here that when you're permitted to sell little drugs in a community where small crimes are permitted in those communities, there's an understanding by these people in those communities that they are more impune in that situation than they were before. Hence, if you live in a community where before you were oppressing another part of the population, if you were selling drugs, you are more likely to believe that now you can do it a little bit more than before, because there is no police officers going you. Even if they send one police to the favelas every 10 years because they believe something really hard is happening, the situation for those communities will be that in the most needed cases, they won't risk it because of the analysis OG. Envision, when you adjudicate this point, please, a police officer in Alabama being called and saying, look, there's some black guy beating another black guy. You won't send the police officer because you believe that your own life is at risk. It is at risk that you go to prison, and the comparative is some black guy calling another black guy. We think that in time, within 10 years, probably this will reduce and be solved. In their side, the communities they ought to protect are fucked up by not having the option to have police due to the fear they envision on the police officers. We think we clearly win this debate. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and Mr. Kaufman, the Member of Government.
Panel, the top half of this debate have missed the most fundamental comparative. That is, what is it that gets more prosecutions of police officers who commit these abuses so that we can have a more functioning police system, and also one that individuals have more respect from, specifically in the types of communities that opening opposition say they want to administer the best justice in? Three things in this speech. One, I want to weigh in on the question of moral culpability and end that and prove why closing government will win that argument. Secondly, I want to talk to you about prosecutions and whether the most important issue in this debate. And thirdly, if I have time, I want to explain why change happens internally because of the power and influence that these police officers have. But first of all, to weigh up on the moral culpability side of the top half, I think this is effectively example tennis that meaningfully never gets into kind of any degree of significant analysis. I think it's very important to understand why it is that these individuals who are highly ranked ultimately are the ones who are culpable. Because ultimately, for responsibility to be adhered to, it is ultimately the person who is most responsible for the outcome that ultimately occurred. I would posit that lower ranking police officers, who ultimately a lot of the time are heavily socialized into cultures and environments that instruct them that if they do not follow orders, ultimately they will be the ones who die, their friends will be the ones who die, their civilians in society will be the ones who die, tend to be very quick and effective in order to following the orders that are given to them. They genuinely believe if they do not adhere with the culture that has been constructed, the people will die. If they do not get at the MS-13 people Ronan talks to you in the POI, simply nothing good happens. But it's not easy enough to just implement policy and just say from opening opposition to you that changes everything. That is untrue. Things like de-escalation techniques, which have been proven to work in when you confront an individual who you believe to be armed, cannot be administered at a policy level if individuals do not enforce them on a day-to-day basis. Simply having something from above can often be disrespected by police officers at the very top. People joke about regulators. They say that they're tying their hands behind their back and stopping us from getting at the real crux. People in the US, elected sheriffs, go on television and say, we just want to be freely released. In Seattle, for example, police officers go knock around people's doors and encourage them to vote for certain parties that will remove the democratic limitations that have been put on them. People are sent with dangerous equipment into certain areas. This is all the fundamental responsibility of those higher ups. That's why they're morally culpable and those who are lower ranking are less likely to. And people know that, by the way, and that is a key factor in prosecutions, which we will move on to now, which is the issue of prosecutions. What is the problem? Effectively, that there are very few of them. Why is that? Because there is a contextual understanding for most people that they were in a great degree of danger when they committed these acts. A lot of the time, for many abuses, particularly the ones that are the most difficult to get, things like shootings, for example, those individuals are considered to have been under immense personal pressure. They were under danger. A lot of the times, the context of their life in that working under a highly stressful job is put in there. They are able to accrue significant amounts of sympathy. But also, they are effectively able to blame their higher-ups, who can never be held culpable, and said, this was the culture that I was a part of, and I am not morally culpable, therefore I should be let away with this. And in places like the US and in Europe, these individuals are often not prosecuted by governmental authorities who don't think it's worth it, and where the decision to prosecute is often run by the government in those kind of functional democracies, or in places like the US, you just don't have grand juries who choose to do that. As a result of that, you get very low levels of the capacity to convict those individuals. What are the problems that stem from that? First of all, intuitively, a wrong has been committed, and there is not any justice for that. That's important. You should consider that on its own. Secondly, police feel untouchable. They considerably see individuals going after the perps or whatever rhetoric they want to say and getting away with it, and they feel like they can commit those actions again and get away with it. But thirdly, and in direct response to opening opposition, the communities for whom are the victims of this police brutality are furious. They genuinely believe that the police are untouchable, they can't be gone after, and no matter what happens, this is something that is fundamentally ineffectual, that they'll never get any kind of meaningful sense of justice. Why do we fix this? No, thank you. Our mechanisms for this. First of all, the evidence base for a conviction in these kinds of crimes is comparatively much larger. In a localized shooting context where that happens, things like evidence are narrow, there are often very few witnesses involved, and all the other contexts mean that it's very difficult to kind of get those degrees of prosecutions. This is very different when you're trying to prove cultural influence, because there's a lot of witnesses who you could talk about in the years leading up to that, where you can ask what kind of an environment were they ultimately creating, and you can compare that with the El Paso example that Ronan gives. But significantly, other contexts there are very significant in terms of just how there are many cases of the kind of individual this has been, their interactions with other officers. Had they been adhering to the correct and proper policies over a prolonged period of time, what had they been doing? Secondly, these individuals are significantly less sympathetic. They were not in physical danger. They were not normal or poor individuals. They were often well-paid, usually more well-educated individuals who do not and are often in themselves not the kind of individuals who accrue the same kind of courtroom sympathy. It's also important to bear in mind here that these individuals ultimately are the type of people for whom there are many factors you must consider. That they are people who are in severe contexts where they're in danger. Want this piece of paper there? Yeah, go ahead.
Your entire case says that there is low prosecution rate for criminal acts. The logical conclusion of that is get more prosecution and do it as hard as you want. But it is not to prosecute someone who's not criminally liable.
We already explained the reasoning as to why those individuals were criminally liable in the first place. But we also explained that this is a far more effective mechanism to ultimately get those individuals. And purely in the context of where we want to have people gaining the benefits that we illustrated to you, this is something that is more important. Third mechanism as to why we get more convictions. This is a broadened definition of culpability and is therefore ultimately easier to have more people being convicted than otherwise would have been before. That's just a simple context in which we are broadening the context out. There are more people. If yes, we may put more people in prison, but we ultimately gain the benefits of having a judicial system that has less bad cops in it, a policing system that has less bad cops involved at the centre of it, but also we have a policing system that works far more functionally. What are the impacts of this? We create significant incentives to change, but we also create a perception of justice that we are going after the most senior individuals involved, that we really care about this and want to take this seriously because we are going after the people who are making the decisions on a day-to-day basis. That is something that's visually very powerful, but ultimately it leads that we get more better community policing and a far more sense of significant accountability that doesn't happen otherwise. Thirdly, on why change happens. Police officers and these individuals at the higher ranks are the best placed to administer the kinds of changes that accrues. Because they are the type of individuals, even the ones who don't commit these crimes, but they fear that they might get done for it in the future or they might be prosecuted in the future, will be the ones who will lobby for these degrees of change and lobby for these degrees of influence. These are people who are more politically influential in these networks. They're often the people who are engaged in regular conversation with political individuals who are at the highest point, and we often imagine that this will likely incentivize corrupt individuals to ultimately resign and move down from these positions for fear that they may be prosecuted in the future. Panel, ultimately, the most effective way to have a policing system that works better and has more people who have faith in it, and have better localized community policing, is one where we have more prosecutions of people who are committing abuse and decouple them from that system so we can get significantly better policing. I am very happy to propose.
I thank the member of government and I have to call upon the member of opposition.
All right. Opening governments say that they want to enact this policy on the level of a local police department chief, right? Note that the entire debate so far talks about specific individual police departments. What we're in closing opposition specifically bring you is why this is harmful for the general political conversation about police, why this prevents large-scale cultural changes in the police that we think are necessary, why this leads to less transparency with police officers, and then finally why those 2 points win us the debate. All right, quickly. Why does this not necessarily lead to less police brutality per se, and also not to massive cultural change, right? Like, first of all, note that there's reasons why police has this culture in the status quo, right? Something no one really has analyzed so far. First of all, believe that there is some self-selection of who actually goes to the police, right? Like, people who value law and order and are generally already more likely to regard criminals as like lesser people or as people who have lost their right to be treated as humans are just more likely to go to the police, because people who don't have those views are more likely to have a negative view of the police in the first place, right? This is why police in the status quo has such a large structural problem with violence and racism. So even if OG are right and police chiefs try to change their culture, I think they're not necessarily going to be sufficient, because the people in the police still hold the same opinion, because it's people who want to join the police still hold the same opinion, and because they're still going to spread that opinion throughout the police. Now, secondly, I believe that it's just a kind of coarse culture within the police that is propagated by everyone, right? First of all, individual policemen, who are probably quite likely to actually, have those views themselves, are still going to inflict them on new colleagues. For example, it's very likely that veterans who have a record of police brutality are going to try to get others, new joiners, to also commit acts of brutality, so that they are seen on equal ground and no one can rat the other out because they themselves have committed the same things. We believe that is also propagated by, for example, the media and politicians who just like to present criminals as an incredibly big threat because that gets them attention. That is also still going to permeate into the police, and we don't really get any analysis of why they can be upset by a police officer saying, oh no, they're actually just people and we should treat them nicely. Finally, I just think there is a strong incentive on police officers and politicians to demand to be tough in crime, right? Realize that the places with most of these issues happen, namely the United States, have both police chiefs and district attorneys typically be elected positions. What does that mean? That means you have to appeal to your electorate. That electorate largely demands tough and crime policies from the police because they believe that that is the best way of keeping them safe. That means that, first of all, police chiefs are probably going to be as harsh as they can in any case. Secondly, attorneys will be extremely hesitant to prosecute. In case of low-profile cases, they'll probably just let them fall under the table. In case of higher-profile cases where you can't do that, it's likely to just answer very lax policies. Now, why do we get less widespread cultural change under their side of the house? I believe that leads to a mechanism of scapegoating and kind of moral licensing, right? What happens right now when we have a big profile case of police brutality that's impossible to ignore, something that involves the death or something like that. I believe that leads to the police as a whole institution being put under pressure, and politicians and media and activists saying the American police as a whole is racist and violent, and the entirety of the United States need to change their policing culture. That means that even cases in individual departments also affect the behavior of, say, the New York Police Department, the LA Police Department, or every little police department in America. Under their side of the house, we believe this more likely to be seen as personal responsibility, because we literally hold a person responsible, and it's going to be seen as, oh yeah, that one individual department is bad and is corrupt. That person was bad, they're now in jail, we have solved the problems, we did it, guys, because that feels good, right? That is where politicians and attorneys can score points with voters. That's where media get clicks, because they present a narrative that people like. That means that locally, lower level officers don't really question themselves because they believe the problem has been solved, right? The bad police commander has been sent to jail. Nationally, they believe we also believe, well, this person was bad, we have sent him to jail. Under our side of the house, however, there's going to be much more public pressure being put on the institution. It's much harder to deflect that blame onto a single individual because we don't single out an individual in the first place. Now, OG says we still get culture change because deterrence, and everyone is kind of affected by this deterrence, right? First of all, note that deterrence never really works because people generally believe that they can get away with things. That's also why deterrence is not why, even in places where we have capital punishment, still a lot of crime happens. Secondly, note that police specifically is likely to believe that because they probably have very good relations upwards, right? They probably personally know the mayor. They probably work very closely with the district attorney. At that point, even when no actual corruption happens, which is probably their best case, which I think is quite likely as well will actually happen, it is probably still likely that police think that they can get away lightly. At that point, the deterrence kind of fails. Now, opening.
Yeah, sure. To counter the political incentives of tough on crime you talked about, is exactly what we want to counteract. If there's fewer dead on our side of the house because police chiefs will enforce the better culture, we think that that's a trade-off that's worthwhile, and we think that that exactly counteracts the incentives you talk about.
First of all, I think you never really give a mechanism on how we manage to combat the demand of the population for people to signal that they're being tough on crime and doing something for them to be protected. Secondly, even if you're right, you just rebutted one of 3 mechanisms, and how that doesn't change. Congratulations, 2 still stand. Alright, cool. Why do we get less transparency under their side of the house as well? Note that currently there's a strong push for more transparency within the police force. Things like body cams, things like numbering officers, like having independent investigations into the police, right? In the status quo, police chiefs kind of have an incentive to somewhat go along with that, because the police is generally seen as violent, is generally seen as brutal. At the point where they have more transparency, they can improve their public image, which is something they want, because like it's not because it affects things like how much funding they get, how much generally like they are being attacked by activists in their daily life, etc. On their side, there is no more incentive for that for police chiefs, because everything that is being uncovered by this transparency will be used against them. That means the commanders try to maintain plausible deniability. Why they're going to be successful is that lobbying. First of all, we think they're being seen as experts on crime, therefore very likely to actually be able to affect Parliament, because the average parliamentarian probably doesn't really know much about that. But secondly, also just because they're a very popular institution in a large, more conservative part of society that feels like police generally protects them, right? At a point where we have less oversight, we believe it's harder to uncover police brutality and easier for officers to defend against it. Why does this case win us the debate? Regarding opening government wants less police brutality. We believe that we've already kind of analysed why that's not going to happen in their world. But even if it occasionally works, we still have less knowledge of cases and less large-scale change for the 2 mechanisms I outlined. Now, CG wants more prosecution. First of all, we don't really buy that this happens, because the same narrative of the police is good still applies, because the same contact between police chiefs and decision makers still applies. Secondly, we never really hear why more prosecutions are necessarily good if the culture doesn't change. Prosecutions only happen once brutality has already occurred. And thirdly, we don't get more prosecution when we don't get to know of more cases. Proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition. We have to call on the government whip.
In the status quo, prosecutions for police brutality rarely succeed. The thing is, sometimes they do. Sometimes there's video evidence, sometimes it's undeniable, sometimes there were loads of witnesses. Our contention is that the cause of that brutality is the same kind of cause of the brutality that doesn't get reported on. What happens in the status quo? There's no incentive for any one police officer to not err on the side of caution and shoot someone, or in the instance that they're racist, choose to do that, choose to use excessive force. But if you're a commander who is not just being assessed on one police brutality case, but every single police brutality case that happens within your precinct, you expose yourself to massive risk, which means you will implement the kinds of policies that OO concede are effective. And that is why we're winning this debate. I'm firstly going to talk about opening opposition, then I'm going to talk about closing opposition. Firstly, on the issue that the first issue that opening opposition said is that these people aren't morally culpable. We have a couple of new mechanisms that are pretty good. I think the first thing is we probably illustrate the culture thing better than opening government does with our talk about El Paso. And in that there is racist rhetoric, there is the sort of things that you pin up. But I think in terms of what we talk about, which is better, right? We talk about things like loadout. So what happens in communities is that people call up for domestic abuse issues and a SWAT team is sent. That is a choice that a commander makes. And we think in those instances that they will stop doing that. No, thank you. But thirdly and most importantly, there are implementation of policies like like de-escalation. I point out that OO do concede that these exist, and I think with the fact that you can realise that in places like Ireland, for instance, where police are trained in de-escalation, you have almost no police brutality, whereas in the US you have huge amounts of police brutality. I think the reason for that is not because Irish police officers are better people, it is because not in small part, because I think we do think culture plays a role here, but it is because they are trained to not be brutal. And I think by being able to talk people down, by being able to improve people's perception skills. So, for instance, when they don't have the ability to say, "Oh well, there's an instance where somebody pulls a gun and that sort of thing happens." What is our contribution here, right? We suggest that there is an incentive currently on the part of police commanders to not implement these policies because they're unpopular because people who want to just do the police work. They don't want to be caught up with these things that they don't see as relevant to their work, especially because they haven't seen the value of them yet. Because when police commanders are dealing with budgets, they're trying to decide whether to buy new uniforms or invest in more training. Even if it's coming from the top down, the allocation of their budget will go towards the things that they have an incentive to provide because they're listening to their officers in the status quo. We give them an incentive to stop listening to their officers and start caring about the implementation of these policies. It's the time you spend because you think, well, I need all these officers on, I've got these shifts I'm trying to manage, and if I've got to send people away for a training day, then that's obviously going to hurt my ability to police work because I'm going to be busier with shift work, I'm going to have to move around, because this is the day-to-day stuff, right? You're thinking about how am I going to have enough officers on, and you think, oh, I don't want to pay that much overtime because you've got someone over you. Then you do have a severe incentive. That's why this stuff doesn't get implemented, and it's why it doesn't happen. And fourthly, there isn't a mechanism in the government to actually make sure that these commanders do this, right? Because internal investigation committees are often police themselves, and there's a sense in which commanders are seen as it is a thing that OG said, but we're linking to an impact that wins the debate. So I think that's why we're winning, right? It's because we're making that impact as clear as possible. This is how we stopped corruption in the police, right? Because you had the same problem. Because if once you made commanders culpable, the incentives changed massively. I will tape opening at this point.
Yeah, every city in the world has a ghetto in which the criminality is very high and that is threatening the life of the people living there. These places, credit of minorities, are the places where abuses happen. It is simply unlikely that the reduction of police brutality is so big as the crime there, and it's unrebutted in this debate that that's the case.
So I will rebut that in a second, but before I finish, I will rebut that now. So this is their point about how police... Okay, so at the end of that, right, insofar as they concede that the implementation of these policies is the important thing, right, they also concede a level of moral culpability because if we prove that police commanders could be doing something and they are not doing it currently, and we've given them an incentive to do it and they continue not to do it, right, then I think it's clear that they chose not to do that and therefore are responsible for police brutality cases if they constantly recur. This is also the case because our analysis suggests that you probably won't be prosecuted meaningfully for cases that happen to do just one-offs, the kind of things that you're not likely to be responsible for. The police commanders who are responsible for this will be, for the most part, those police commanders who are heads in those police departments where brutality is endemic, right? So that therefore suggests these are particularly morally culpable individuals in this instance. No, thank you. This idea of police work getting worse. The status quo here, I think, is that these are very extreme cases. I think there are plenty of times when commanders are very sure that officers will be fine, but there's no incentive not to send out a full team or someone with an assault rifle or just to train them, that sort of thing. And I think people will continue to send to like all sorts of areas where police brutality isn't the case. Because also police brutality happens in places that aren't crime-ridden. It happens to black and brown individuals living in suburbs when police are called to a pool party because of noise complaints. And insofar as we stop that happening, I think we're satisfied with proving a huge benefit. No, thank you. But let's talk about those extreme cases. The first thing I point out is if these are bad, as people suggest, police aren't going to these areas anyway. They don't go into favelas because of the interests they outline. So I'm not sure what the impact is. But secondly, in terms of drug cartels, I would say the way to fight the drug war is to take out the top level, to engage in things like stop fighting the war on drugs. But what happens? Because they think this works, right? The demand for drugs, which is the only kind of crime they analyze as being endemic, right? The demand for drugs is staying constant, right? Which means there's always new criminals and always a need to make lots of money out of this way. So if their benefit is police going into these communities is such a good thing, that forces those drug cartels to arm up as much as possible, increasing the level of violence so they continue to operate. That's not good for those communities because you increase the level of violence in those communities. So even in their best case scenario, I don't think police going into these communities is actually a good thing for them. I think what is a good thing for them is getting justice and being able to engage better with those communities because now they trust you more because they've seen high-profile prosecutions of police commanders. We talk about, for instances, like Ferguson, where trust of the police is massively broken down because they saw no prosecution. We think that because the analysis we give you about how police commanders are, first of all, more likely to be, in the instances where they're successful prosecutions, but also more likely to do that. In terms of CO, I think media backlash, that we explained how there's way less of that in terms there's way less of that with police officers rather than people on the ground, because there's a far less emotional narrative in terms of them just having to defend themselves. But also in terms of demands of the population, I don't think people are actually demanding to be tough for crime, especially in those instances where those communities are facing brutality. It's a case in the 1990s. It doesn't stand in 2019. I'm delighted to propose. Thank you very much.
I thank the government whip. Kick off on the opposition.
It is regrettable that we have police officers that hurt innocent people without any reason. It is regrettable all the police violence that happens at protests just because they believe they are illegitimate because they protest against an authority. It is regrettable the whole police culture that is a culture of violence and the culture of listening to an authority, and we believe that these things should change. However, we believe that this is not the solution, because in the end of the day, this brings less transparency, less long-term change, and on short-term, you ruin the life of a person who has nothing to do with it. And more than that, you make police being less efficient and more focused on things that they should not focus on. But more than that, regarding our case. Okay, let's see what the government says to us. And we see that government is concerned about moral responsibility and about how we will have more prosecution for people who do harm. Firstly, regarding moral responsibility and moral culpability, we tell you the fact that most of these commanders are not entitled, they can't be rationally entitled for what those people do. We thank the opening opposition for the portrait they make of those people not being always on the ground with their people. We thank the opening opposition for the portrait of the fact that those people are people who action very much under stress, under risk, and they are very likely to do an irrational decision at some point. If you're guilty for something, be punished for something, but don't punish an innocent person for something that he isn't in control of. We believe that yes, indeed, police officers should be punished if they do something wrong. They should be punished for violence, for brutality, for all those kind of things. We believe that this should be the case in the moment where they actually did something, rather than if it was something that they cannot control. In general, we give people the presumption of not being guilty of something. We should do that with police officers as well when it is the case. Okay, moreover, regarding how we'll have more prosecutions, Dino explained in direct engage with opening government, with closing government. What we tell you, and Dino already explains you that this will not lead to more prosecutions, because police officers already have a lot of relations and a lot of connections with people who should prosecute them, who should do all this kind of work. They already do something more. They will do something, or they think they will be able to escape with that. Moreover, what we say to you is that this will generate a less transparency in the whole police departments. Why? Because they will try more and on long term. They will try more and more to hide what is going on in their department. They will try to hide this signs of brutality. They will try to help each other do those kind of things instead of aiming for more transparency in order to change the popular opinion on them. Okay, these are the cases of the government. What we say on our side of the house and how we differentiate ourselves from the opening government or the opening opposition is that we bring you a long-term solution for this problem. we indeed identify the problem that police officers are doing these kind of brutalities. They happen, they are regrettable. On short term, we agree with the opening opposition who says that they're going to be less efficient because they're going to be more careful in order not to get in prison or other kind of stuff. What we say is that in general, the actual problem is with the fact that there is a horrible violence culture in the police departments, that they are learned to be violent and they are learned to be brutal. They are usually themselves being subjected to violence or brutality from their superiors. They become frustrated. They action under risks. They action under pressure or threat. What we see more is that those police officers perpetuate this culture among themselves, and we believe that on long term this is the problem. This is the problem that should be resolved in order to solve this problem. We believe that with your solution on your side of the house, what happens is that we treat a symptom on short term. What happens on our side of the house is that if we find measures of changing this culture, we actually solve the problem. So doing this characterization of police officers and seeing them as they are, being frustrated, being in a vicious culture and a vicious circle, what we say to you is that what's going to happen to them is that they're going to be less transparent. Moreover, what we say, what Dino told you is that this cultural change won't happen because they will still perpetuate this among them. This is a long-term problem. What we say is that media, people, the government still protect the police, still trust them, and we need them to trust. We need these police officers to be trusted. Before moving to our impact, if there is any POI, close it.
When police are called to help people who are victims of assaults and robberies in extremely dangerous areas, they do not go to help them. They go in with SWAT teams, and they go in with a tendency towards brutality.
Okay, they are going there, and this is regrettable, and we give you on this side of the house that this, on your side of the house that this happens. What we tell you is that firstly, you should not criminally condemn a person who's not guilty for that, who probably wasn't even there, and ruin their entire life for something that he can't possibly rationally, humanly control. And second of all, that by prosecuting them, you make them even more careful and even more less focused on the intervention, but more focused on trying to hide those kind of things. And we don't solve that actual culture that is vicious and that makes those police officers do that. Moreover, what happens is that we give you the public pressure as a mechanism to pressure police culture into change, to pressure police culture into not doing that anymore, into being more transparent, all those kind of things. This is a point that has never been engaged to on their side of the house. So at the end of the day, what we gain is more transparency, a change of culture, police officers who actually protect and they're focused on their work. On short term, we want more protection, even if we have some guilt. And on long term, we want change that actually happens. We want a culture that is healthy and that we can trust. So, in the last round of Athens EUDC 2019, very proud to police.
Hi, thank you. We have enough debate, but